Hello and welcome again. I have the pleasure of welcoming John van der Linden again, this time to talk about the challenges of the West meeting the East. Now, John, you've been a Global Open Innovation Manager at P&G for some time, but before that, you spent 12 years at P&G China. Could you reflect on how P&G China evolved from its first entry in China?
Yeah, when I first moved there was in '96. It was still the early days. It was still, China was very much rising. It was in Guangzhou, where the southern province of China, where we entered initially. And I had the role of basically helping develop Ariel and Tai to get out there. And then over time, we moved to Beijing at the end of my 4 years out there.
What were the innovation priorities of P&G at the time?
At that point in time, I think there were two things that we really needed to do. One was we needed to be a Chinese company, as in we needed to show that it wasn't a win for P&G, it was also a win for China. That was true in the way that we had to work with the authorities, right, in terms of getting systems in place and distribution in place. It also was true for our employees. The employees clearly care about their country at a very high level, right? So again, laying out that we were doing the right thing for China. And the third one was in terms of development of local supply of raw materials. And that goes very much with the second point. The economic class was still very narrow, right, and moving upwards, but the number of people who could afford our products was still limited. So we had great products, they loved them, but not everybody could afford them. So the challenge was, how do we take a chunk of cost out of it? And we were up against local competition, and it's amazing what some of the Chinese companies were doing on a shoestring and amazing products. So we really had to reinvent how to make a detergent. We had to reinvent how to make a toothpaste to get the cost structure right and to appeal to a larger user base.
And of course, P&G China was extremely successful. So you really managed to combine good quality premium brands with low cost. A 2013 global survey actually revealed that P&G detained 3 out of the top 5 consumer brands in China. Very, very, very impressive. Now, strangely enough, your chief executive, Dave Taylor, just a year ago actually announced that you did take China a little bit for granted and you underestimated the sophistication of Chinese consumers and their willingness to pay top dollar for good quality products. Did you live that?
Yeah, I think that was more my second stay out there. It was in 2006 when I moved there for 8 years. And what we were starting to see is that China was no longer one homogeneous country. It was very much starting to split up. So you had still parts of the country that was virtually unchanged since 20 years ago, where people would still work the fields, have a relatively low income, watch the TV commercials that you showed them, and then go to bed early. But then you had this emerging new economic group that were in Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou that had an income that was premium or even super premium. And they got very interested in top-notch products from Korea and Japan. And that was a tough competition for us because our equities, our brands, had been launched to basically be affordable for everybody. But here you had the consumers all of a sudden wanting the top and the best and what have you. So that was a stretch. Also from a product point of view, we were used to an attitude that if a certain product was good enough for the US, in like an Olay product, it probably would also work in China in terms from a packaging or an appearance point of view. But that was no longer true. So we had to flip things around. We had to start developing things for China, for that super premium channel. And then if it worked there, it would probably look great in Walmart as well. So it became a fundamental change. So my first day in China, I learned around how do you reinvent the low end of the cost. I think my second end, and I think that was David referring to, is that we're still reinventing the high end.
Excellent. So timing is of crucial importance. You have to co-evolve with the middle classes, not take them for granted. If we can just go back to culture, what are some of the cultural differences you noticed between P&G Europe and the States and P&G China?
Well, let me say that culture obviously is incredibly important, and there is no superior culture. So one of the things, if you want to be a global company, you quickly have to realize that your role is to get the best out of the people, and people come from different cultures. So the fundamental thing that you'll have to do is become very humble and look at yourself and realize the culture that you bring. And once you're self-aware, you can start looking at the culture around you and how you you deal with that. So I always describe it for myself that I have a compass that is unchanged, that will always be on north. I mean, giving respect to people, being honest, believing that people come to the office every day wanting to be the best they can be. Those things are true independent of the culture you go to. I think there's a second is more like a map where the drawings and the way that things are put on the map are different by different cultures. And you need to understand the local map in terms of how to behave to make sure that you get from A to B in the right way in the local environment.
Okay, so the more global you become, the more humble you become also culturally. But what are the core differences in China, the core cultural differences that struck you most?
I think there was about 4 of those that really stuck with me. One of them is around relationships. So the West tends to be, you go in and you say, look, let's get a result. And if that result is there, fantastic. And maybe we'll build a relationship, but that's okay if not. What I've seen in China, it was much more you start with that relationship. And a relationship is typically something built on shared experiences. So you have dinner together, you show pictures of the children, you get to a point where trust exists. And then you start looking at, hey, is the business something that we can be successful at as well? So it's a different way of going about it, yet extremely important, because I've seen Western companies show up with, a bunch of papers that they want the people that they have just met, please sign, at the bottom line. And that's not the way it is. So I think the relationship is one element that is extremely different. A second element that is very different is around how leadership plays. So the Western leadership seems to be much more like a conductor. I need to get the best out of my people, and I don't need to be the best violin player, right? As long as I get the best out of that group in total. The Chinese management style, although that it's changing, but used to be significantly more around you need to be able to do a job and then the next job and then the next job. So when you became a boss, you knew your stuff. So you would tell your employee, on Tuesday, I need this. And then the employee would get you on Tuesday what the boss wanted. But if the results weren't very good, because there wasn't enough time, the employee wouldn't necessarily feel accountable because the boss asked and the boss is always right and what have you. The third element is around learning. The way that the West learns is by raising questions, challenging, very active, while the Asian, or definitely the Chinese way of learning was more, you sit back and you mimic what your teacher is doing, and it's more by absorbing rather than challenging. So if you give a training in China, it might feel like you have very little engagement, but yet it might be something that is just driven fundamentally different. So those are some of the core differences that I've seen.
Very interesting. So you talked about trust, talked about leadership, you talked about learning. Maybe that fits in with my next question. A common stereotype is that Chinese employees are not so great at taking personal initiative because they have been versed in a culture of harmony and aversion for conflict. Was that your impression? And if so, how did you manage that?
I think it's a beautiful observation. I was talking to some of my employees in China at one moment, and one of them said is that it's very difficult to say no to a Chinese boss, but it's very dangerous to say yes to a Western boss. And I think that is summing up where things stand. So in a simple mind, I like to think that there is a little circle with 3 entry points. One is attitude. The second one is assertiveness, and then the third one is accountability. And that's a bit of a circle that I see things moving around. So the attitude, I think, is something that is extremely joyful as a Western manager to work in China. I had some of the best times with my group in China because the attitude always was of we can do, we want to learn, we want to grow. The second thing then becomes assertiveness, and if you're not careful, people will take what you say as an order. And rather than saying, well, you know what, that's a stupid remark, right? I make lots of those. So somebody needs to then, make you aware of it, or timing isn't realistic. And the assertiveness was given by that leadership style. People were careful of committing to certain things you asked for in terms of saying no. And as a result, the accountability wasn't there. So it was this circle that you needed to be very careful about. So I think assertiveness is the one where most of the rubber meets the road, where most of the engagement needs to come and change.
Okay, so that's a critical challenge here, managing these assertiveness, these differences. Excellent. Let's talk a bit about open innovation. In week one, you talked about open innovation quite eloquently. Are there some differences between China and Europe in terms of open innovation? Are the challenges different?
I think the challenges are a bit different in basically two aspects. One is if you go and connect with people from a very different culture than your own, it is harder to do that work, right? So if you go to a great university in China, but the English is a bit less and the building is cold and you know the way that people have a certain way of expressing things that doesn't necessarily resonate from you, you're going to assume that there isn't much wealth in terms of knowledge. When you then go to Singapore and you know they're used to our contracts and they speak fantastic English, then it might be easy to walk away and assuming that everything in Singapore is fantastic, while in China it would be behind. Well, if you really scratch a little further, that is not necessarily the case. So I think it takes a little bit more work to make sure that you understand it. The second one is the one that we've touched upon a little earlier. It is about relation, right? You got to invest in a longer term relation to get the best out of it.
So in week one, you distinguished between gardening and fishing in terms of open innovation. Are the challenges for gardening and fishing the same in China or different?
I think that they're different. I think you're right in the sense that gardening was about, you know, how do I plant some seeds and grow something that I know I will need in the future. I think doing that with a great university in China or a great player in China can definitely work along the way. The shopping part where you look around and say, what do you have, is a little harder, I find. I mean, there is either a great salesperson that has been trained to tell you that everything is possible, or you have to do the effort yourself to get into the framework. If you think about the Chinese Academy of Sciences, it's an amazing institute and there's so much knowledge, but just figuring out who to talk to, who might have something for you, is really hard work. So it is a little harder.
So fishing and shopping are the real challenges. Okay, I think let me conclude with a last question. How do you see the future evolve? And let's be more practical. Do you think that the future is to globalized practices, or is it more to people becoming more ambicultural, of learning to take the best of both?
I think it has to be the second, right? I think culture is something that, despite the fact that the world is connecting better than ever before, culture is going to stick around. It's not going to change all that quickly. And we're in an odd situation, right? There's a country that has 5% of the inhabitants of the world, and it has the largest economy. That's not going to stay that way, right? So China and India will become part of the largest economy. So part of the challenge, I think, for global companies is to really operate in that way. So I think it becomes more and more important to do that. There's a second element which I would also bring in, is that the way that we work in the West is that we tend to make a plan, step A, and then step B, and then step C, so we can go to our boss with a year-long plan in which we plan for success. In reality, given the speed of change that we're going through, the Chinese way of working, which is more, you know, crossing the river by feeling the stones and just get started and then, you know, adjust and start and then talk to a few people and adjust again, is probably very beneficial in certain situations. So the fact that the West learns to see how innovation in China happens, I think is going to be crucial as well.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you.
So if I can just conclude on this point, connecting and trying is probably one of the practices we really have to take on board. I think there are many more practices, but we'll leave that to the next step. Please stay tuned. Before that, please let me thank John again for being here. John, it was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.